Good morning. Thank you for coming along this morning to the University of Western Australia and this Feeding the Future event that the university is hosting. Quite an exciting day with a full program and seminars throughout the day. So if you haven't grabbed a program, may I encourage you to do that, because there's lots of exciting speakers throughout the day, displays in the banquet hall that maybe some of you saw this morning, also some displays outside. I'm going to talk this morning about agriculture engineering and some of the work that is happening at the University of Western Australia in that space, in particular practical research solutions to challenging global agricultural problems. I'm planning to speak for about 35 minutes and allow ample time for questions afterwards, and I think there's a microphone down the front here that a staff member will pass around should you want your question to be recorded. Okay, so feeding the future, it's obviously a very challenging problem, something highly relevant, very topical. We're at a point now where we recognise that our existence on the planet is somewhat fragile. And if we look at the Food and Agriculture Organisation's definition of food security, that's that bold text that you can see on the screen. So all people at all times are to have physical, social and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences. If we're hoping to achieve that by 2050, then food production's predicted to have to increase by, say, 70%. There's other numbers out there as much as 100%. And that's quite challenging if you think that that's coupled with climate change, the increased population, increasing urbanisation, the decrease in arable land that's available for agriculture, etc., etc. So I'm going to talk around some of these points today, and I'm also involved in the panel discussion this afternoon. So we need to increase our, so just some simple sort of mathematical logic arguments here. If we can increase our land use, then essentially we're increasing our farming area. Then if we can increase our yields from that area, i.e. the tonnes of food we produce per area, then this will obviously lead to more food that is available for feeding humanity, say feeding the animals too, and well, essentially feeding the plants too with nutrients so that they can be used in that food cycle. That last dot point, the returns, we need an economic driver. Well, the first two are quite interesting and sound sensible from like a logic point of view. Obviously, we need economics to help us drive those or activities in those spaces, like government regulation or within the private industry, and that is brought about by, say, economic drivers. So if we can increase the value add and have more dollars per tonne, then that will stimulate activity in those areas. So why is agricultural engineering important? So I'm an engineer, and you're well aware of, particularly in Western Australia, there's been lots of talk about the mining downturn. Thankfully, there's some mining activity and new engineering jobs in that space at present too. That's also made the media. But we've also just come out of an election where we probably see that the result was somewhat driven by a bit of an interesting hole there in the microphone. The result from that election is probably driven quite a lot. Is this mic still on? By the fact that the state had a very strong mining economy, and we are now in somewhat quite different circumstances. And there's been lots of talk about what's going to happen post-mining in this state. Is there potential for agriculture to step up to the plate? Agriculture already plays a significant role in Western Australia and Australia. It's just that it's coming out much more into the open and telling some good media stories, and so there's quite a lot of interest in this space. Agriculture engineering, as the name suggests, merges agriculture and engineering to apply engineering techniques to agricultural applications, and so that's where I apply my research. So I'm going to talk about some of the work I'm doing in this space, and obviously, clearly, I think it's important. It's my profession, so I'll try and illustrate that in the next little while. So why am I speaking with you? I'm speaking with you because from the work that I've been doing, it's received quite a lot of media attention and had quite a lot of success. I'm the WA Innovator of the Year last year for some research that I was conducting to do with restoration of degraded lands, and I'll talk about that first up here this morning, and there's some other interesting projects going on. So I think I'm well placed to talk to you about this. So what I also want to try and illustrate here this morning is that, like with lots of innovation and good research, it comes about through multidisciplinary activity. And so although, clearly this is a mining application here, and we'll see that the first bit of the focus here will be about mining, we'll see that from those outcomes they'll clearly translate into agriculture. And so if we look at this image, maybe some of you recognise it. It's Mount Whale back in the Pilbara. It used to be a mount. It's now a rather large hole, and it's had its surface area significantly sort of increased through that mining activity where it's been opened up and the resources have been pulled out, so the iron ore. And then there's these legacy issues about what's going to happen to that degraded site into the future in terms of restoring it or rehabilitating it, depends on the terminology you want to use. Maybe some of you aren't aware, though, that there's currently, despite the terminology about mining downturn, there's actually currently $1 billion worth of mining projects that are currently on hold or rejected by the government and the previous government because of the mining companies' inability to convince the regulator that they will be actually able to sustainably restore those sites post-mining activity. And what they actually have to achieve is about 70% species diversity and coverage of that area. And at the moment, they're achieving about 15% with industry best practice. So clearly, we need a game-changing attitude in that space. And so hence why I'm working with scientists in this space to try and help us bridge that gap. Obviously, these rather iconic West Australian images, very popular with tourists, similar landscapes, also pertain to large, say, cattle stations in those areas. And so we want to be able to restore these sites so that they are available, say, to you, to your children, our children, into the future, and also not leave future generations with those degraded landscapes. So the government authorities, in terms of those figures I was talking about, they obviously need to be able to use native plants in that restoration process, and the only way that they can do that is to use seeds. It's not feasible to actually plant seedlings, etc. So, just further sort of getting an idea of how big an issue this is. There's currently 2,300 square kilometres of degraded land. That's about 60 average size wheat belt farms. There's a lot of seed involved that's needed to restore those sites, and the reason why there is such a lot of seed is because seeding success, or the germination from planted seeds, is around 5%. That's probably pretty good if you could achieve 5%. So you plant 100 seeds, you're lucky if you get 5 to come up. So there's a lot of seed involved in this. The collection rate of harvesting wild seed, you mainly harvest it from wild stands, is very low. We're talking about 6 tonne per annum. It's going to take centuries to collect that seed at present. It's going to take centuries, or at least many decades, to plant that at the current rates that they do, which is essentially ranging from broadacre casting by hand, like broadcasting seeds, walking out there and throwing seeds like this, or ad hoc devices that have been designed, say, around bulldozer tines, ripping, etc. So the dissemination costs of planting these seeds is very, very expensive, and so all of these are in a red box because they're indicating that it's highly unlikely that we're actually even going to be able to restore the sites we have degraded at present. And that is obviously not a good thing. So why is it so challenging? Well, and this is where we'll start to try and tie it more to the agriculture event that we're talking about today. Unlike domesticated seeds, so like wheat, barley, etc., that have had the benefit of, say, millennia of breeding, etc., to be better behaved than their wild cousins, these are badly behaved, they're wild, And so this is a typical grass species spinifex. It's badly behaved. It's got these fluffy appendages. And so these are awns on the right and bristly hairs. And these are needed in their, for natural mechanisms of rejuvenation. So maybe attaching, say, to the side of a kangaroo as it moves through the field or the landscape, and then disseminating into a new patch of land where it can germinate. But obviously they're not very conducive at all to mechanised approaches of planting, and that's what we need if we're going to be able to restore these sites, is start adopting the techniques that we see in agriculture and planting fields and crops, etc. So hence why we were interested in working in this space. So we invented and patented a device through a collaboration between the University of Western Australia, Agricultural Engineering Activity, which I led, and the Botanic Gardens and Parks Authority, or Kings Park. That's Kings Park Science. You're probably well aware of Kings Park being a very beautiful barbecue venue. It's also got an extremely strong science institute up there with about 60 strong researchers, and they are considered right up there, probably world leading in terms of the restoration sort of work that they're doing from a science point of view, and also science here at the University of Western Australia. So again, this multidisciplinary approach. And so what we did, and there is the seed flamer in the banquet hall, and I have one of our research assistants out there helping me man that today, Elvin Ling. So if you want to have a chat with him, please do, or myself. So what we did is we piggybacked some technology that is used for coating seeds, drum seed coater, which has a rotating base inside a drum. And these sorts of technologies exist already in the horticulture industry. If you buy seeds, say at Bunnings, and they've got coatings on it, that's sort of where they come from. Those coatings should, they don't always, contain beneficial compounds in there to actually help with the germinability of that seed inside. So they might contain things like triggers in there so that only after a certain amount of moisture does the seed germinate, or coatings on there to avoid predation so they don't get eaten, or fungicides, etc., etc. So we implemented some flaming apparatus inside there so that we could then have a continuous stream of seeds moving within that drum, and each seed essentially goes past a hot flaming event, which is enough to remove, if we do it repeatedly, those fluffy appendages, but not enough to damage the seed inside from that heat energy. So in the order of seconds to minutes, we go, these are scanning electron microscope images, we go from what was the badly behaved thing to much better geometry. Those numbers are seconds here in this case. And so we have controlled appendage removal. And then lots of the improvements come about because we can significantly reduce the volume or increase the bulk density, and this has huge ramifications for transport. At present, many of those native seeds are harvested in the Pilbara, transported to the southwest, transported back up to the Pilbara to be planted again, etc., etc. So we can significantly change the volumes involved there. It also means that if we have these seeds in a hopper on a mechanised device, and we have students working in this area, like PhD students developing mechanised seed planters for native seed, then it means that they will be able to stay out in the field longer, they'll be able to be much more efficient, etc. And that's brought about because of that bottom plot with the flowability. That red line indicates that seeds above that, and there are seeds at the display in the banquet hall. So on the left-hand side, untreated seeds, they don't flow because they tangle together, and that's why when you disseminate them by hand, they typically are a big ball of fluffy seed. But within a few moments of our treatment, they then can flow, which then opens up the opportunity of us having them go through mechanised seeding devices. And that's pretty much where the game-changing significance of this work is. And then coupled to that is that then we are able to apply coatings in a much more successful way, because instead of us trying to apply coatings to those seeds that have fluffy appendages that are flexible, and then we're trying to apply a brittle coating to it, it means we don't have to bulk it up so big, and it also means that we can get a full coat around there. And these coatings are extremely important because instead of us using a seed in its raw form and having about a 5% success rate, if we're lucky, we can get upwards of 30, 40%, and we're doing work in this area at the moment. So obviously that means that like an 8-fold increase in terms of the success rate. It means using less seed. It means the seeds we harvest will go further, et cetera, et cetera. So again, just highlighting multidisciplinary R&D project between Botanic Gardens Parks Authority, Kings Park Science, and UWA, so agriculture engineering. We did all the engineering in-house in our Faculty of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences workshop. So we built the device in-house, which is great because it enables myself and my researchers to go there and look at the developments and tweak things as we move along. And it's a very sort of practical, hands-on thing that feeds into sort of even my design teaching. So as I mentioned, so also UWA Science here as well. I won't talk too much about that. And so what? Well, from the mining point of view, this is just the area of the Pilbara indicated in black, and those little yellow triangles indicate current mining activity, and they're pertaining to that 2,300 square kilometre of damaged land that we have at the moment. If we've got a problem at present, then we're going to have a really, 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 really mammoth one in the future. This is the government's own data from, I think, the Environmental Protection Authority. But anyway, it's the government's own data looking at mining applications that are currently under assessment. So if I toggle between them again without it changing, yeah, you can see that it's a significant area. Those are actually tags. They don't actually denote the area. They're just denoting the points of applications where they're applied. So we are going to have issues, obviously, into the future. So that obviously has a big impact. We can't change the area of damaged land at the moment, but we can reduce the tonnes required per hectare to restore that. And that's those factors that I'm talking about, well, I was talking about before. So like an 8-fold increase if we use coatings. It means we reduce the collection from centuries to decades. We can increase the seeding rate because now it seems feasible that we can develop technology similar to what's used in the agriculture space. And if we can do that, then that will significantly reduce the dissemination costs. So it's in a green box because now it becomes highly feasible. And we are continually doing research and development in this space. So here is a summary sort of slide about that project. So what I'd like you to focus on is the restoration flower on the right, the red one. I've been talking about the mining context. That's why the mining petal is fleshed out a little bit. As I mentioned, this innovation won the WA Innovator of the Year award last year. And it was focusing on the mining context, but I think it's quite logical and easy to see that this will translate across to farming lands, degraded farming lands that need to be restored with native seed, desert lands, so like in the Middle East, where they are trying to restore those sites with native seeds as well. Grasses cover a significant portion of the world's surface area, and so if we're working in this space, it's got huge impact. Wildfires in the US, so they have their rangelands and they are mandated to restore them each year. They spend about $100 million worth just on buying seed per annum. And so there's significant potential here. And that potential is essentially sort of grouped here in that if we can have native seed mechanisation, it will likely translate into increased grazing potential. So we can actually have denser coverage of some of those sites where, say, that are being grazed at the moment, some of those degraded landscapes that maybe have got salinity issues, et cetera, or that have lost their ability to be arable, can then start to come back on board potentially because we can use native species which are much better adapted to our conditions. And we may even identify, say, new crops, and that might be new grains that maybe could be used to feed animals, might even be new edible grains that could feed humans. Maybe they haven't been looked at because they've just been so awkward to handle up until this point. To facilitate some of that work, we actually have just been awarded a Global Innovation Linkage project for the next 4 years, and that's already looking to work with industry and US partners, particularly in the area of wildfires and rangeland development. So that's sort of one project, and that's around that theme of that first bullet point that I mentioned at the start of increasing the amount of land that we have available potentially. So something like this has that potential to increase the amount of land that we can use for food production. Okay, so then if we change tack a little bit to increasing yields, this is completely in a different project, but I've grabbed an excerpt from a paper published in Science. So and which highlights that yield gap isn't static, and it also highlights that we need to, there's some significant challenges around this yield problem. So it's tricky to maintain our current levels, let alone increase them, and that's because things like weeds develop resistance to the control measures that are developed. So a nice statistic here just to put things in perspective. So even with that last project, I talked about the economic drivers. I think it was quite easy to see how they play in that field. And here we're talking about $3.3 billion of cost to the grains industry in control measures for weeds and lost revenue. So that's a significant pain point and hence drives research and innovation in this space. So I lead the agriculture engineering activity of the GRDC Targeted Tillage project, so the Grains Research Development Corporation. This is a national project that goes obviously across the nation with the weed science led out of the University of Sydney and with various universities and government departments involved, industry partners and farmer consultants. They're involved to make sure that what's developed at a university is practical and will be adopted quickly. We need solutions that are actually going to be adopted and are taken up by the industry quickly. We can come up with amazing innovations. This isn't just in terms of agricultural engineering. We can come up with amazing innovations as smart humans, but there's a risk that there's no point coming up with something that's brilliant if there isn't actually a take-up of it or it's not addressing a real pain point or something. So, background and motivation of this particular project. So Australia, as you're probably aware, adopts in the grains industry a conservation cropping approach. And we have very, very large areas. So average farm is about 4,000 hectares. So if you're thinking about, for example, linking some of the achievements that say come out of Europe or some of those other advanced first world countries, for example, where they are at the forefront of certain agricultural activities, it's not a given solution that what they have been developing will apply or be applicable in our Australian context. We are very different here. We have different soil structure, we have huge areas, we have remote operations. Logistically, they're quite challenging. Even the talk about lots of big data issues and things, they hinge on poor communication that we have. I'm sure that you're aware of your phone dropping out as you move across the landscape. So there's significant issues we have here in this space. Australia adopts conservation cropping because we do have poor soil structure that is prone to erosion from wind and water, etc., and moisture losses. We are experiencing an extremely dry start to this winter, and so that subsoil moisture is very important, and if we can maintain that stubble cover from the year before, that will help with that. And we are also big adopters of controlled traffic, so that's tractors and equipment on a farm paired up with the same track width so that you drive on tram lines. Essentially, you drive on the same patch year in, year out to avoid soil compaction. That conservation cropping approach is, at present, essentially 100% reliant on herbicidal control. Herbicides, like antibiotics, give rise to resistance because unless you can wipe out a whole population, then those ones that had the traits to not be wiped out can continue on and then produce essentially offspring. or ones that now have the traits to survive. And we have a herbicide resistance problem in Australia and throughout the world because of the application of herbicides, and then coupled with that, the chemistry and the programs that are developing new herbicides are struggling to come up with new chemical mechanisms that will work in identifying new herbicides. So it's a very tricky situation we're in. So along that line, we were looking at site-specific weed management, and probably some of you have heard about things like, say, the Weed It, Weed Seeker, spray nozzles, which facilitate farmers not having to blanket spray their whole crop, but when they sense a weed, they'll spray that. Our technology sort of couples with that same idea of we identify a weed, but instead of us spraying something on that weed, we will mechanically hoe it out. So just like you would, or your ancestors, or you do in your backyard, in your veggie plot, you use a hoe to chip out a weed. That's essentially what we're doing on a broadacre scale. And so there's a prototype outside that you may have seen out there, and that has sort of a segment of a cultivator bar that depicts what we're doing in this space. And as I mentioned, we have farmer input in this, and so on the left is Ray Harrington. You might be familiar with that name. He's the inventor of the Harrington seed destructor. He's walking through a field here and kicking out a weed, and we're sort of thinking, well, why can't you do that sort of in a mechanical fashion? Obviously not with a boot, but with something that's a bit more like something to chip out a weed. So on the left is a large field, an Australian field, for example, and on the right is sort of the context around what we're thinking, which is low weed densities, so one weed, say, per 10 square metres. And then as you move across the field with your large cultivator bar, instead of having the cultivator bar engaged with the soil tilling the whole time, have the tines out of the ground and those blades up. And when you sense a weed, bring down the corresponding one here, for example, to chip out this weed. Obviously, we're moving left to right. Okay, so we wanted something that can be quickly adopted by practitioners, so we thought we would use something that's more palatable to them. So using or piggybacking off existing technology, so reduce, reuse, recycle, to limit farmer investment and also have the timely development. Although robots and swarms and things will become prevalent in agriculture in the future, we need things that can actually happen in the interim, because the herbicide resistance problem at present is very real, for example. So we need more strings in our bow so that farmers can achieve these outcomes with weed removal. So as I mentioned, have the device in a standby position just above the soil. When you sense a weed, chip it down to bring it out and then lift it back up to the standby position so you're ready again. All right, so like I said, there's a prototype device outside. Just quickly, this is sort of it in action. So that is a segment of a cultivator bar. Obviously, you'd have multiple ones of those across a cultivator bar, so you can achieve quite a lot of weed removal as you move across. And the type of work we're doing sort of hinges around, from a research and development point of view, say tool-soil interaction, from a experimental point of view, from a simulation point of view, and that is at the forefront of, say, tool development and, say, work in this space at present, because everything else that is sort of like in the earth-moving industry is slow speeds, and we're doing stuff at high speed. So there's maybe an exciting field for some of you to get involved in the future. And so we're reintroducing tillage into conservation cropping because it's targeted, and although the focus is national, the application's clearly global. Finally, so feeding the future is the theme, so that's why the future bit's in italics here, because now we'll move to a bit about a university perspective. The university has the UWA Future Farm 2050 project, 1,600 hectare farm in Pingelly. Obviously, the aims are to imagine the best practice farm for 2050 and build and manage it now. And it's based on mixed practice and showing that that's practical and at the forefront of current technology. So that's it from Google Maps. It's comprised of lots of little paddocks and bits and pieces. So one area, for example, that we're working in is looking at, there's trends throughout the world. If any of you have been to ag fairs, there's some really good ones, big ones in Europe, and there's big trends obviously for really big tractors. So is bigger better, for example? If we go back to that idea of trying to actually farm more land, so have more arable land that we can farm, then perhaps there's arguments to say not really, that's not very manoeuvrable around rocky outcrops and say tree outcrops or near fences on farms, etc. So maybe we need to have devices that are paired up better with the landscapes they're involved in, can work more on the undulating topography. So this is quite timely. So just earlier this month, UWA has partnered with Ausplough, and they've quoted me sort of here, but essentially it's just around that same thing I just talked about, in the sense that we need to be able to crop more land that we already do actually have available. If we can do that, then we will clearly lead to higher yields. And then if we start to adopt some of those other technologies like the targeted tillage device, et cetera, we can start to have a multi-layered approach that can help us achieve this. So we're also doing work to help with, say, informed decision making. So with the engineering project students, things such as what new equipment to buy. Say I've had a few good seasons, I've got quite a lot of capital. Should I buy a new tractor, or should I hold off and buy a swarm of tractors or a swarm of robots? Or should I replace the fences that are getting to the end of their life, or should I pull them out so that I can move throughout the fields better? What crop orientation should I have for efficiency in terms of planting or harvesting, or maybe weed distribution? Should I change the location of the depot? That might be, say, the shed, or it might be like when I have my refuelling truck or my herbicide truck, etc. Should I put that in a specific location to increase the efficiencies? Should I have an unmanned aerial vehicle like a drone, or should it be a ground-engaged vehicle, etc.? So we do work in this space too. And so just quickly, because I want to allow time for questions, in the centre, that black image is sort of like 3 paddocks with their boundaries, and then area denoted by, say, the rocky outcrop or the part of the field that you can't go in. And then, so this looks like a Pac-Man image. This was obviously a trivial field with multiple robots going in it. But we can start to do things like seed that with plants in the longest direction. And so we have then, say, a Gaussian distribution. So these plants are randomly distributed in here. The weeds before an activity, this is a zoom in, this is after. Some of those weeds aren't successfully removed. So we can look at how that changes depending on what we're using. We can look at, if we use 1 tractor, how long that'll take. If we use 3 or something, and we're optimising how they move throughout that space, what will happen. This is that depot location. This is a different field, but like blue's indicating that if you could move your location to there, say on your farm or whatever, you would have savings in terms of costs. And then looking at, say, things like using simulation techniques to help with the spreader distribution. So as As the cutting bars on harvesters, top view of a harvester, get wider and wider, you're able to bring in more heads off the crops, but then they have to spread that residue matter out the back, and the spreaders struggle to spread that evenly, so you get an uneven distribution. That has implications for the reintroduction of the carbon back into the soil, so subsequent yields. Also the application of, say, herbicides on there, because you're trying to get through now a large dump of material, your seeding tools, etc., struggle. So we're doing work in that space, looking at how we might be able to improve that. And we also have a Innovation Connections grant working with Rosner, the people that developed the Marshall multi-spread, looking to develop and improve variable rate technology in that space. And so, summarising, so working with industry and government to feed the future. Talked about some different projects here, and they're sort of indicated, and so maybe a bit of inspiration. I think come join us. I reckon we can feed the future, and let's do that. So I can stop there. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Okay, thanks very much. Congratulations. I like what you're doing and the multidisciplinary approach. You said, I'll stop there. Just a question, are you continuing on and collaborating with, say, the health sciences? Because it's all about food. It seems, we're under the heading of feeding the future. We've got, lots of problems with population health at the moment. You name it, we've got epidemics of who knows what, and so there's a lot of focus on where our food comes from and what's happening with the growing of it. So are you looking at following through your research into see what it does to us? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. In simple terms, yes, but we can increase, I personally can increase my activity in that space. And this afternoon in the panel discussion, we are looking at linking sort of that whole across the food chain argument that you're talking about. In particular with the work that I'm doing, I am very conscious of those problems. I plan to move more into that space to actually demonstrate how this can move forward, and I think it's particularly relevant. Obviously, we want to have a healthy society moving into the future, and like if we have nutrient deficiencies in the development of babies' brains in their first part of their life, et cetera, we have massive issues. But I think that tackles that pain point of that emotional thing that we're hopefully all feel passionate about. And at the same time, I think we can get better at demonstrating the economic ramifications of some of those aspects in terms of, like you're saying, in Australia, we're very well known for having good beef that we export, et cetera, and I think those sorts of things will become more important into the future as the world really wants to know what is it that we are eating, where's it coming from. So I think if we can couple that also with the economic drivers, then it can actually sort of filter back to these sort of grassroots research, pun intended, to help us achieve those outcomes. I think that hopes to address that. Other questions? Comments? Cheers.
Thank you. I was just wondering, with the flash seed, once the land is restored in X years, what happens to the original seed? Because don't you need all those complex features for it to then be able to distribute itself?
Yeah, okay. Good question. So our intervention with the native seed and removing those appendages is not that dissimilar, and we are doing work in this space to actually quantify this, that dissimilar to the natural fire mechanisms, say, that are involved with burning those seeds. And if the plant germinates, I suspect that it won't translate, at least in the short term, to generating offspring that don't have those attributes. I think that would take lots and lots of breeding over millennia. I'm not a plant scientist, as you can probably tell, but I think we are quite confident that the seed you plant, it will germinate, it will generate a plant that had those attributes, they're retained, and then those natural mechanisms like the wind, transport, the water, the anchoring to the soil, the attaching to the side of a kangaroo, et cetera, will still be facilitated. It's just that we are trying to do something to help us mechanise that process of getting the seeds back into the soil very quickly. Any other comments, questions? Oh, another one?
I was just wondering if you could go back to weed detection and weed sensing. Is that strictly manual, or are there machinery that detect weeds?
So there are mechanisms and machinery that do detect weeds. Our particular project doesn't focus on developing the weed sensing technology. There's actually a talk that's happening at the same time as me from the Sensing Microelectronics Group team leader, Professor Lorenzo Ferrione. And there's sensor technology that's developed at this university and at many universities. It's also very well developed in the commercial space, so like those Weed Seeker, Weed It devices, they exist already. Some of them are based on simple things such as even detecting green on brown. So you have the fallow situation, you've harvested your crop over summer, you get a sporadic rain event, some of those weed seeds germinate, or it might even be previous crop plants germinate. You have a green plant, brown background, you can sense that quite easily. I won't go into the details of how sensing works, but there is quite a lot of activity, research institutes across the world and commercially. It's quite practical, and there is a GRDC project looking at that in particular too, related to this project, but it's happening in parallel to this.
I work in an industry where I have to get
Oh, okay.
spinach and things, so I was just curious.
Yeah, so the horticultural, so that's interesting. So the horticultural industry, so vegetables, so just if I'll digress, I'll go sideways for a little bit. The broadacre cropping and say cereals and grains and etc. is very different to horticultural plants, because horticulture is high value crops, typically irrigated, but very high value, like, you know, it's expensive to buy a fancy piece of spinach, etc. So the technologies that are developed for even achieving, say, automated or mechanised weeding are very sophisticated already in that space, like robotics, etc., because they can justify spending that capital to achieve that weeding outcome. In broadacre cropping, and you have a growing event which say lasts 2 weeks, is when you say want to chip out a plant from, say, it's this big to a certain growth stage. And if we're talking about trying to cover 4,000 hectares in 2 weeks, you need to have quite a wide device or move very quickly, etc. So there's very different attributes to driving research and development in those spaces. So horticulture, very small areas. Average farm size, this isn't necessarily horticulture, but average farm size in Europe, 16 hectares. We're talking 4,000. So like it's very different, yes?
I think I'll just...
It's the recording.
All right.
Yeah, just a question. I saw that the flash flaming technology is patented, so I'm just wondering to what extent that is in, like, who owns the patent and to what extent it's enabling or hindering your research and development. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, the Seed Flamer does have a patent pending. The University of Western Australia is pursuing the patent with the co-developers like myself, the co-inventors of it, and we are in the process, and this is part of the proceedings of winning the WA Innovator of the Year award and spending that money. We are fleshing out the commercialisation plan to ensure that it actually does move into something that can be adopted by industry. So if any of you are interested, obviously we're at that phase. So towards the end of the year, we'll start to look at which countries and jurisdictions we'll actually apply our patent in. So we've gone through the provisional patent time, the PCT, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks.
One more question?
We essentially finished on time. So I do hope that you can go to some more seminars, have a look around today, and thanks again for coming to the University of Western Australia. Thank you.